Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with basically my first FPL video of the year. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. If you're new to the channel, I'm effectively a channel that looks at creating basically tier lists and cheat sheets continuously. I watch both the games and also have a look at a lot of the analytical data that we have both historically and also prospectively, especially with the season and also even the preseason at times, to kind of get a light of how I feel about certain players. And I usually do a cheat sheet every week that kind of updates how I think players will do in the short term. But since we're actually starting off with the draft, I think it is worth looking a little bit longer term. So this video will actually be a bit more of a kind of player price review type deal and look at the first 8 game weeks, so a little bit longer than expected as opposed to game weeks 1 to 4, looking at that back half of those 4 to 8 games and then that international break and potentially the players that you'd like to have in your team. The thing is, when you're drafting off in game week 1, you do want to think a little bit more long term because most of these players are going to stick with your team for a while and even up to game week 10, unless you're planning to do an early wild card or some dramatic things happen. We have another pandemic, so on and so forth. So as you can see with the schedule here, I've kind of had a tabular list of how strong I think the fixture difficulty is. I've also discounted each game week in terms of the strength of schedule. So game week 1 obviously having a good game there is much more important than having a good game week in game week 8 because you have much more chances of transferring players out. The strength of schedule, therefore, of a specific team is going to be kind of based on how front-loaded the good fixtures are. And you'll notice in this list here, that's sort of why teams like Tottenham and Man United, even though they seemingly have a good schedule, I'd say Tottenham still have a relatively tough schedule, especially since they face Chelsea, who are a bit of a bogey team, and then City, who are a very, very tough team, do have it slightly harder. And then Man United as well do face Liverpool, which is probably going to be a very, very poor matchup. And you'll see here that I actually end up rating Leicester games and West Ham games quite well. That's part and parcel due to how strong I think those teams ended off last season, and just performance-wise, West Ham, for example, overall were very, very strong compared to a team like Aston Villa, who actually have a very, very good front half of fixtures, game week 1 to game week 4, and are probably a little bit higher on people's estimations, especially with a good preseason performance versus Man United. But as you can see here, this is more of a long-term look of the fixtures, and I do actually really like overall Arsenal-Chelsea fixtures because I don't think there's really much to talk about with Liverpool and City. Ultimately, we're probably going to have 4 to 5 of their players within our teams. Therefore, it's actually really worth thinking about maybe getting even an Arsenal defender. I do think there's a lot of valuation there that people haven't looked at. I think the issue, of course, is with Zinchenko joining, you don't really have a note on whether Tierney is going to start consistently or how that battle is going to play out. Even Tomiyasu with his sort of condition, even last season, I think overall and career-wise, he's had a lot of injury problems. So that's going to be a factor to think about. And you don't necessarily want to budget down to go for someone like Ben White, who doesn't seem to net the most amount of points compared to someone like Gabriel, who actually could be quite interesting at 5.0 since he is a constant goal threat and is actually a bit of an Iron Man in that he can play most of the games for Arsenal. With Chelsea, there is a bit of an X factor with how well these new signings will gel under the Tuchel system. We've seen new signings for Tuchel fail. We've also seen them work out tremendously. Players like, for example, Ben Chilwell had a fantastic season, and I think there's an expectation there that he will once again return to form. And if, let's say, Koulibaly and another central defender joins Chelsea, then you could have scope as well to play James, since hopefully he would be playing right wing back a little bit more. But the depth now with Sterling coming in on the winger position does add a little bit of question marks over whether Chelsea will actually kick along. I think their midfield as well is getting slightly more aged, so that's a question mark there. Whereas another team like Tottenham have strengthened. United still got a few, I think, signings that were key, especially finding a sort of replacement to match it just well with Lissandro, and then having a manager that seemingly a lot of people are confident about. But once again, remember, this is preseason, so I think putting too much faith in Man United immediately off the bat is probably going to be another question mark. We saw much more from Tottenham last season at the end of the season, where we think, especially with a lot of their signings being, I think, just pure upgrades or even just an addition of depth, that it makes a lot of sense to probably place a little bit more faith in a team like Tottenham. And I think if you go down the list, you can see Leicester, West Ham, and Aston Villa. Those are 3 teams I think we should target, including Brentford and Newcastle. Brighton Wolves is a weird one. I think you have a few gems there. You could revisit, obviously, Sanchez as a keeper from Brighton. I'm not really sure in taking out the 5.5 in Undav, but I think there is a potential there. With Wolves, you have Neto at 5.5. So there are options from the teams lower down in this list that we can actually think about. Nottingham Forest did actually strengthen their team a lot. I do think Crystal Palace's schedule is quite tough, so I don't think it's really worth considering them. A team like Leeds, for example, though, I mean, Jack Harrison could step up and have a big season. He will be probably trying to replace Rafinha as the talisman there. I don't really think Luis Sinistera is necessarily going to kind of hit the highs that Rafinha did, and that's going to be a question mark. But I think Brentford, for example, is really well set up for Tony to have a good season at his price as well. A little bit cheaper than options like Watkins and Wilson, who are great options too for Aston Villa and Newcastle. But I think Watkins is just slightly overpriced in my opinion, and I think the kind of ability to move into players like Buendia, Coutinho, or even Leon Bailey is much more tempting for me from an Aston Villa point of view. You could even go into Matty Cash, but I don't think it's really worth it at this point in time. I do think this Aston Villa team will be a little bit more chaotic than in the previous year when we saw them get quite a few clean sheets. I know they strengthened at the back, but I still think with the way they play, they are actually quite expansive, and therefore I do expect them to concede goals. West Ham is actually one of the solid teams last year where, especially when you look at their league standing and position over the last 2 years, you would expect them to have players that we'd find in our teams, but it's so weird because their talisman is Bowen. He is reasonably priced, and I'll actually talk about Bowen later. But there's not much interest really in getting a West Ham player, and I think that's the key thing. It seems like a lot of our teams will be front loading teams that we expect to probably find themselves within the top 5 to 6, that being Liverpool, City, Arsenal, Chelsea, United, and Spurs. But one of those teams will have to kind of make way as well. I think what's nice about Chelsea is with so many people hedging around defenders, given the midfield price increase, you have much more confidence, I think, in the Chelsea defenders because they were players that were already there last season. I think there's a bit of a basis to say they will do well with Tottenham. There were a lot of key signings, but I think a lot of them strengthening positions and kind of hopefully bolstering some of the roles and the key talismans from Spurs within Kane and Son. And, you know, that could mean things like, for example, Kane not necessarily needing to drop deep all the time. Someone like Bissouma, I think I'd have much more confidence in as a midfielder than over Harry Winks, as an example, and also the ability to no longer play two defensively minded midfielders and have someone who's a little bit more creative in box to box and could actually run into the box and create some more pressure there to support some of the attackers within Bissouma is quite huge. I also think that Perisic is a huge upgrade from the left wing back position, and it also gives us much more stability in terms of being able to pick Spurs players. I think if you also look at Antonio Conte's comments in terms of transfers, it seems like he's not actually as high on Jed Spence as a transfer that he kind of vouched for himself. So it seems like Jed Spence is a bit more of a project player, and I think there is scope to even say that Doherty could have a very good season as someone who could start consistently for Spurs as well. So those are all little things to think about with the fixture difficulty. But let's actually move on to the tier list. So let's actually get started with the keepers. As you can see with this tier list here, I've factored it into 4 sort of colors. You have an S tier, an A tier, a B tier, and a C tier. C tier players are players that I'd like to not really like to think about right now. I mean, you could think about them in the future if suddenly there's a huge kind of change in form. Some of the players in the C tier, of course, are players that I don't expect to be playing consistently, right? For example, you have the opportunity for Guaita to actually become the starting keeper for Crystal Palace again. There was a bit of a dynamic there with Butland, and then you have Dubravka, of course, who's going to be overshadowed by Pope, I think, in Newcastle. De Gea, Schmeichel, these are players at 5.0 where I just think that there are better options at 5.0, and sometimes that's just how it is. This season, we actually got treated to a price decrease for goalkeepers, and that was kind of to make sure that they become a little bit more enticing when you're actually looking to go for goalkeeper premiums from top teams. And as we can see, Alisson becomes the top option as a 5.5 keeper. I think he was extremely efficient, and if you look at column kind of 6, the 21-22 ppm per price, that's looking at previously last season and how efficient a specific player was. Alisson, of course, tops the charts next to Raya, but remember that Raya didn't play the full season compared to someone like Alisson, and Alisson shows really great efficiency, especially compared to some of the other top defenses that we usually herald being options that we think about when we're drawing from defenders such as City and Chelsea, or even Spurs at the end of the season. If you actually look at clean sheets wise, actually Spurs did end higher than Chelsea, and there was a lot of promise, I think, to think about coming into the next season with Spurs defenders, but that's more so with the fullbacks. If we look at just pure keepers, Alisson performed the best. I think he's clearly the best 5.5 option, and that's kind of why I'm not really interested in Ederson at all. The one drawback to Alisson, though, is that he does lock yourself away from a third Liverpool player and the ability to kind of rotate between that third Liverpool player. Last season, we were all playing with 3 Liverpool players pretty much perpetually, but sometimes we had moved away from someone like Jota in the midfield to someone like Roberts in the defense, and it's much harder to actually move away from a goalkeeper, in my opinion, because you're spending a transfer in a keeper is not exactly what you want to do early in the season. It feels like a waste of a transfer, and the -4 always seems like it hurts the most because keepers are probably one of the least efficient positions, I would say, to move a transfer in, because the upside isn't actually as high compared to a midfielder or a defender. With Raya, as I said, very interesting, but there is a bit of an asterisk there because Strakosha is going to come in and there will be a fight for the #1 spot. So I think thinking about this and using this as a basis, I would say the Brentford #1 will be quite interesting, but perhaps that's a transfer that we'll have to make in the future, or even considering a wild card. I wouldn't really start the season with Raya just because I'm not sure who's going to actually start. Perhaps we'll get some comments from Thomas Frank as to who will become the #1, but I don't really think we're going to get that kind of clarity before the season starts. As far as Pope, I think he becomes a tremendous option. Yes, the efficiency metric is really, really poor. He's actually worse than some of the players that I've actually put in some of the tiers below, but I think it's just looking at someone like Dubravka, who's a bit of a comparison point for Newcastle last year. You also have that cutoff of Newcastle having a horrendous start to the season and then actually showing up with a lot of defensive signings in the winter in the previous year, and then also showing up once again this year with getting Pope and Botman. I just think that there's so much upside there at that price for Pope, and you don't really have to kind of think about going for options from big teams with the keepers. That's the kind of the beauty of them. The one kind of drawback with Pope, I suppose, is that there's other kind of very competitive 5.0 keepers. We have Ramsdale, we have Sa, we have Mendy as well, who are there in the tier below. And the reason why I kind of put Pope there is just because I think for me, I think that Ramsdale backline with the Arsenal team was slightly overperforming the previous year. I don't think they've necessarily made key defensive signings that I would say would improve their ability to stop clean sheets on paper. In fact, I think Zinchenko, for example, is a bit of an upgrade in terms of maybe getting consistency, in terms of getting a starting 11 consistently, especially when Tierney is injured. But I don't really think that changes the defense too much, really. I think the Arsenal defense is going to be quite similar to last season. I think I'd expect them to be slightly worse, if anything. I think the Arsenal defense slightly overperformed. Perhaps we'll see whether Partey will be able to kind of consistent part of this Arsenal team. There's more, I guess, to develop on that, but I expect Ramsdale to kind of fall in terms of value. Sa as well, I think we were beginning to see a bit of a drop-off with Wolves in the second half of the last season. I just don't think there's enough of a basis for me to say that Wolves make a lot of sense to start the season off with, even though their fixtures are relatively decent. With Mendy, I think that's probably the biggest criticism I'll get for putting Pope as a top-tier option, as an S-tier option, and then Mendy as an A-tier. I just think that when you're looking at Chelsea, right, and how efficient their defense is, the way they play, how dominant they are with the ball, they don't actually concede many shots at all, and therefore it doesn't really create many opportunities for Mendy to actually get saved. So I think the fact that the efficiency metric shows Mendy so close to Pope, but Pope's situation is so much better this year, in contrast to, let's say, a Chelsea team that actually will probably still lose Azpilicueta and have already lost Christensen and Rudiger. I just think there's much more upside there with Pope, and I think that's why Mendy's kind of sitting there in that tier. Sanchez and Meze are options. Meze is a huge outlier here with 0.62 in the efficiency rankings. He's actually the worst in this entire list. But Leeds, as I said, have gotten a lot of signings that I think would actually help their defense. Mark Roca was someone who, when I was watching him back in La Liga, and unfortunately didn't get many minutes in Bayern Munich, was a very solid defensive midfielder, but someone who wasn't really, I would say, the finished product. You have Tyler Adams as well, who's kind of in a similar mold coming from the Bundesliga, and then you also have an upgrade to the right back position too. So that could be the kind of huge upside that Leeds would get, I think, defensively, to say there is a bit of a catalyst here for Meze to be an interesting 4.5 pick. He probably has the most amount of upside in terms of what he can become this season and how much improvement he can be as an option at 4.5. But then you also have a very kind of safe, consistent option as with Sanchez. And I think that might just be a question of how risk averse you are as a manager. If you want to start off safe, I'd say Sanchez actually makes a lot of sense as a 4.5 option. You don't have to deal with the kind of Brentford sort of #1 debacle. You don't have to deal with gambling that Leeds will have a little bit more upside from the defensive point of view, and expecting them to actually get more clean sheets than they did previously, especially now that there's a change in manager and he's had a preseason now to kind of work with his team, or even kind of gamble with a championship team potentially with Travers. And I think Pickford, unfortunately, I actually might consider him as a red option. He really is someone that doesn't interest me at all. I think that Everton defense is absolutely diabolical, and that's pretty much what it is. With Aston Villa, I just think that there's just better options at 5.0. And as I said, I do expect them to play much more chaotically this season. So therefore, not so interesting an option for me, even though they did get Diego Carlos from Sevilla. So with the defenders, I've actually split this list into two parts. This is going to be the kind of first part where we have half of the A tier players and mostly S tier players. And what we can see from everyone's initial drafts is that some people are opting to go for a 5-back. And I think what's different from this season to the previous season is that we now have much more sample size to actually say that defenders make a lot of sense to actually fill out our team with. And you had at various points in the previous season people going for a 5-back very early on, especially when Chelsea were firing with both James and Chilwell being extremely efficient, extremely productive at their prices. I still think they're very, very well priced this year. You can see obviously options as well, such as Robertson actually ending up to be our kind of third and final Liverpool piece, and that kind of forces you to have 2 Liverpool players, maybe 1 Chelsea player, and now you're thinking about getting someone like Cancelo, who was a bit of a mainstay in our teams in the previous year, alongside either an option in Laporte or Diaz if you really wanted to cut down in price. And then the Spurs fullbacks. Spurs actually ended the season with more clean sheets than Chelsea, which is an alarming statistic in my opinion, in a positive sense when you think about going for a Spurs option, because Conte only really had 3/4 or even half a season to kind of impact and create change for the Spurs team. And therefore, I think there's a lot of hope that Spurs options will be very good this year. And I think we have a little bit of comfort in going for Doherty and Perisic, who are players that it seems like they've already gotten the trust of Conte. Perisic in previous years with Inter, and then obviously Doherty in the second half of last season until he got injured. It seemed like he was much more preferred over someone like Emerson. And as I said, if you look at the comments of Conte talking about Jed Spence, it does seem like Spence is going to be a project player. It seems like he will need some time to develop, and I really think that the spot is now Doherty's to lose. So that's an interesting point of view. I would say Perisic, as I said, and Chilwell are the best options to really think about if they're actually able to start the season fit. Both of them have slight asterisks in that they are coming back from an injury. Chilwell, of course, did feature in the last game of the previous season, but he really does need this preseason to get his feet wet. We'll also see what happens with the Arsenal game as well, whether he's going to consistently start some games and actually get good enough game time for us to consider him as a starting option to start game week 1 with. Otherwise, it does seem like it makes a lot more sense to go a little bit safe and maybe just ride it out with James. Robertson had a very fantastic back half of the season, and it does seem like a lot of drafts are featuring Robertson and Arnold. And I think part of that too is because you have the comfort in Robertson playing consistent games, because he's shown physically that he's able to match that kind of level and play consistently week in, week out. Whereas with Luis Diaz and Nunez and even Jota, you have an expectation that there will be a bit of rotation there. Plus, you have that added cost of those players compared to someone like Robertson, who's so well priced at 7.0. Trippier was someone who really did light things up. He does have Man City and Liverpool fixed into that schedule with the first 8 games, but I did think Trippier is a bit of an X factor because he's such an elite free kick taker, and we do expect this Newcastle team to kind of kick on from a defensive point of view. With players like Trent, I don't think there's really much of a discussion point here. Same thing with Diaz, Cancelo, and Laporte. These are mainstays and always going to be S-tier options. Gabriel for me is an S-tier option just because he's nailed, and he also does provide a lot of attacking return. One of the few centre backs I would actually say who's actually worthwhile, because the other fullback options are so rotatable for Arsenal that it's not like there's a great comparison and a guarantee, right? For example, let's say if you go for Trent or Robertson, there's probably more of a guarantee that they'll earn more points than Van Dijk. That actually wasn't really necessarily the case with Robertson being injured at some points in the season, but definitely just on form, I would say Robertson does warrant a place in your team over Van Dijk. With Tierney, he's got an asterisk there, starting off with the next tier, with the A tier, and I think the issue with Tierney, right, is simply just that Zinchenko transfer. We have no real clarity over what the situation will be. It could be constant rotation between Zinchenko and Tierney. We could even see maybe Zinchenko popping up in some other places to try shore up the midfield at times as well. But I think that is an asterisk that, coupled with as well Tierney's kind of natural injury doubts, just makes him less of an interesting option for me compared to his kind of peer in terms of Gabriel, who is slightly less efficient, but you have that guarantee of him playing consistently. Matip, I think, is a weird one. He was someone who actually ended up being that kind of price budget option for Liverpool players, and he did overperform, in my opinion, getting bonus points, getting goals, getting assists even near the second half of the season. I just don't really think he's worthwhile picking, but he is the cheapest Liverpool defender if he was actually to start consistently. The issue, of course, is going to be Konate, who's going to feature in the second half of the list as well, and I think my discussion on Matip really just centers around whether he's actually fixed to stay and play consistently. Them re-signing Joe Gomez for a much longer deal, and also Konate showing how good he was at the back half of last season, even in the Champions League final, for example, versus Vinicius. I really just think there's no scope to actually say, oh, it makes sense to go for someone like Matip to start the season. There's just no guarantee. I think Van Dijk's the one if you really want to cut down on price for the Liverpool defender to go for. But there but if you're going for Van Dijk, it actually might make more sense to go for Alisson at that point. Ait Nouri and Walker are interesting ones. Walker is really also dependent in a sense on the Cucurella transfer and whether that will actually happen. It does seem like that might happen because City have recouped some funds from Zinchenko. And then with Ait Nouri, you do have a player who's actually really reasonably well priced for this Wolves defense, much cheaper than Sa, for example, and could actually take that left wing back spot and perhaps create a little bit more from that situation. That will also have to depend on Wolves being worthwhile, right? Whether they're actually consistently building chances, whether they actually are able to retain the defensive form that they had in the first half of the previous season. Those are kind of things that we have to think about as well, and whether he actually gets consistent game time, because we did have rotation for Ait Nouri in the previous year. With the second half of the defenders, I'm really going to extend this list to really a B tier. I don't think there's really much need to talk about a C tier because there is a huge drop off after those kind of top teams and top fullbacks. And then other teams and other options. So for example, an option like Cody last year, who might have featured in some of our teams, doesn't really seem appetizing at this point in the season, especially since we have options at 4.5 from other teams. And even if you were really talking about pure budget, I mean, you could go for Nico Williams at 4.0, but I'm not really going to spend this video talking about options that we are going to line our bench up with. It's really more talking about options that we're going to seriously think about for the starting 11. So to kind of round off the A tier, you have players like Van Dijk and Tomiyasu, and I've discussed them kind of briefly. You know, Van Dijk kind of slotted in that weird Liverpool dynamic where he's actually 1.0 more costs than Alisson. Therefore, it doesn't really seem like it's worthwhile to go for Van Dijk. You can look at Alisson's metrics. It's actually much more worthwhile to get someone like Alisson. As far as Tomiyasu, you're looking at a player who, in my opinion, is very interesting if he actually plays consistently. But he's actually shown in the Premier League in the previous season. We had several stages and several weeks where we didn't really know what was going on from him from an injury point of view. It seems like he had some kind of undiagnosed injuries, maybe was dealing with long COVID as well. I'm not really exactly sure what the situation is. Therefore, he's still a bit of a question mark, and I think just one to avoid really. You could go for Ben White, but there's not much value there because he's not an aerial threat. As far as Anderson, he is someone who's a mix of both. Some people would also obviously be looking at Mark Wehi as well from Crystal Palace, but their fixtures are really poor. Maybe I'd actually consider him actually truly as a B tier option, whereas Cash and Dean could be interesting because Aston Villa's first 4 games are so interesting, and you could use them as a bit of a gamble at a 5.0 price, right? Over some of the more expensive defenders, or let's say if you wanted to avoid, for example, Trippier's initial run of games where he plays City and Liverpool, and you wanted to move into Trippier later into the season, you could start the season off, of course, with Cash and Dean, and then move into someone like Trippier. As far as Schär, just seems like a worse option of Trippier to me. Semedo's still injured. Players like Cresswell, Mings, Jansen, Cucurella, Konate, these are all players who you really wouldn't think about immediately, and I just think I've added them there because they might be interesting at various points later in the season. Mings probably not, to be quite honest. There's much more, I think, appeal in actually going for Cash and Dean because they actually do contribute to open play, and they actually are utilized in Gerrard's system as attackers at various points in time. So that's going to be interesting there. As far as Jansen, he is a goal threat, but just not much interest there. Once again, it just makes more sense in my opinion to go for a Brentford 4.5 keeper and actually use that money there as opposed to in the defenders where you have the opportunity to gamble with much more upside. And Cucurella, I mean, he could be fantastic if he moves to City, but that's going to be an asterisk for now. And Konate, the same sort of thing, where I really think there's going to be much more rotation between Konate and Matip week on week, and even Joe Gomez as well. So that's going to be a big question mark, and I think potentially you could even argue that they're both B-tier options as a result. Hey guys, I've actually decided to split the video into 2 parts. This was actually done a little bit late because I realized I've actually spoken so much about the goalkeepers and defenders and also my initial thoughts of the early fixtures that I think it'd be worthwhile to split the video into 2 parts. So please do stay tuned for the second half of the video, which is going to be just looking at the midfielders and forwards and my conception and my kind of view on these players, specifically looking at game week 1 to 8 and how good they are really from a kind of player price perspective, from efficiency, and then also kind of the upside from maybe changes in their team this season. So thank you guys and stay tuned.